All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Ant 492 Anthropological Theory. We're going to finish, we're in week 3 on Wednesday, but we're going to finish up our discussion of Worf as part of the Boasian school. And then next time, we're going to move on over to Malinowski. And you got to watch the Mead video and then the Malinowski video while it was out. So hopefully, you'll be prepared for both of those. Okay. Hold on one second. I think the reps are back. We're going to talk about Worf today, as well as kind of the broader Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, as well as the broader, still kind of sub-school of Boasian anthropology, which is focused on the relationship between language and behavior. And if you think back all the way to last week, we talked about Margaret Mead. And Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, and their crew of Boasians were interested in culture and what would we call that sub-school, that perspective within Boasian? Culture and personality, right? How does your culture affect your personality? And oftentimes, with Mead, that was wrapped up in ideas of gender, right? So in certain cultures, men are aggressive, and in other cultures, men are timid and spend time doing, making themselves look beautiful. And in other cultures, women are domestic and take care of kids and are nurturing, while in other cultures, they're practical or they're domineering or they're warlike or whatever, right? The culture, these things that we often think are natural are cultural, and it can be with gender, it could be with family relationships. It was often done kind of in the 40s and into the 50s, especially with like national character. The Russians are like this, right? Their culture makes them orderly and prone to following orders, right? Versus we as Americans, we have these ideas of freedom and independence, which make us hard to keep down and control, right? Something like that. So that's kind of one school of direction Boasian early American anthropology took. And for the most part, when we're talking about early, I'm talking about pre-World War II, and you'll kind of see why. There was a huge die-off of really important, famous anthropologists all right at the same time. We're talking about Sapir and Whorf today. They both died in 1939, 1941. Boas dies in 42. Malinowski dies in 42. A bunch of these famous kind of anthropologists of the early era died right around World War II. So it's kind of a good natural stopping point for our early anthropology. Okay, so culture and personality is one perspective that came out of Boas. Like I said, Boas was very broad, and often people argue that he was not very theoretic. But I think he is theoretical, but in a way that like we've just kind of all absorbed at this point. Like the idea that like cultural relativism is a thing, like it's not a theory anymore. It's just like Ant 101. But a lot of the ideas, right, that he has his students took in different directions. Culture and personality was one. Whorf and his mentor, David Sapir, or Edward Sapir, were the second school, which we would call maybe called language and culture. So if culture and personality talks about how different cultures, oh, I'm not on the doc, sorry, I'm just writing things. There it is, doc can. If culture and personality talks about how people's culture makes them act differently, how it makes their personality, shapes their personalities, what do you think language and culture is all about? What's that school all about? Yeah, how language impacts culture and how culture impacts language, right? Probably one of the most like stereotypical kind of quippy version of this is that you probably heard Eskimos have 100 words for snow, or something like that, some big number, right? This actually comes out of Boas, his research. This is something very similar. What does that phrase mean? I mean, like obviously it means they have 100 word for snow, but what does it mean? Why is that phrase important? Why does that phrase get added around? Why would anyway people have 100 words of snow when, how many words of snow for snow do you have living here in Fort Dulles?
Spanish.
Yeah, two, right? Spanish or English, that's the version, right?
Yeah,
Right, we don't really distinguish. But, you know, I was just in Taos this weekend. If you are a ski bum who lives up in Taos and skis every day, you probably got a lot more words for snow, right? You got words for powder, you got words for ice and different conditions, and whether it's rocky, whether it's marbly, whether it's icy, right? In the same way that maybe an Inuit or an Eskimo person has lots of words for snow. Why is that?
The different types of texture.
But why would they have so many? Why do some people have lots of words for something that maybe most of us only have one or two words for? An environment, right? They're around it more. A lot of it's just like you have to do something with it every single day, right? You're going to be a lot more familiar with it. You're going to have a lot more terms. Think about if you worked a job. What's a job you could do? Any job. You work at a barista, right? You're gonna know a lot more coffee words than someone who doesn't, right? I'm not a coffee person. I'll be like, with cream, no sugar, right? Versus like, I want a double soy latte, mochaccino, light, skinny, I don't know all the words, right? But you're gonna have a lot more familiarity because it's more important to you, right? And so not only are you going to have more words, you're going to start to think differently too. Do you think, Allison, that you think about coffee, if you're a barista, differently than someone like me who doesn't know anything about coffee, right? Not just talking about it, but thinking about it, right? And that's basically what Worf's big point is, right? The way that we talk and the way that we think are interactive, right? Worf was born in 1897, right at the end of the 19th century. And when he started out, you all read the article, what was his real job? This is his real job, before he became like an anthropologist. I'm writing it on the paper. Yeah, he's an fire inspector, right? He's an insurance guy. And that's interesting, right? It's kind of a weird place to start from to be an anthropologist. But he's a fire inspector going around, making sure that like buildings are safe, especially he's doing commercial primarily. Buildings are safe, and if there is an accident, what caused the accident, right? And in the first couple of pages, he does a good job. This is relationship of habitual thought and behavior. The language is probably his most famous, like one of his most famous articles, top 2, top 3. And he starts out kind of talking about this. It does a really good job. He does a similar thing in some of her work where he like takes you on a little journey, right? I'm going to talk to you about my life, and then we're going to use it to talk to about big issues, right? He talks about being a fire insurance guy. And the way that like language was important in the job. How did language affect things like fire safety? It's like a weird thing to be talking about in anthropology class, but I promise you it makes sense. What were some of his examples? He gives a whole bunch on page like 2, 3, 4 of the article.
In this little section, he talks about like the empty drums.
Yeah, that's vapor. Yeah, right. So if you take the gas, if you were hopefully never played with gas, but if you were that kind of kid, right, playing with gas, lighting things on fire, oftentimes it's the empty containers which are worse because you have gas vapors, and if you have a match or a cigarette, the vapors can catch on fire. What did Worf say was the problem with this? Why were people always catching these empty containers full of vapors, on fire at the work site? As empty, right? And we think in our language and our culture, empty not only means void of gasoline that was in it, but also means inert or safe, or there's nothing there, right? It means nothing, right? And this example is like really the key example. He gives a bunch of other ones, right? Like limestone is not actually limestone, or pool of water blowing air over things. But like this idea that language, the words that we use impact the way that we think about and act on reality. Worf was super interested in this. He was like a, nerdy kid. He was interested in languages and stuff. Had video games back in the 1910s and 20s, so he had to read books and stuff like that. He was interested in ancient languages and ancient Mesoamerica, religion, and kind of learning Bible languages to decipher what's in these ancient texts, right? He has this kind of idea of language really early on from a kid. But gets a straight job, was a fire inspector, has a wife and 3 kids, and it's like doing the respectable thing, right? But meets the peer who is Boaz's student, who really kind of takes, Boaz invents the 4-field cultural, physical, archaeology, and linguistics. The peer is the one of all Boaz's students probably who focus mostly on the relationship between linguistic anthropology and cultural anthropology, right? And Worf becomes his student, and they become most famous for this idea, which is called, neither Sapir nor Worf ever called it this. Both of them died very early. Sapir was like in 1939, Worf just like 1941 or 1942 after. Both of them, a lot of their papers were kind of collected after they died by their students and their friends and kind of put them together into books. That's what actually this is from. One of the collected posthumous works. And one of his students, he gave him this name, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It's also known as linguistic relativity. If you're feeling nice, or if you're kind of a hater. Linguistic determinism. And this has been also called the weak version of Sapir-Whorf and the strong versions, depending on how forceful you want to make the argument. And so Worf does this thing. I think it's a really good trick if you're writing to a popular audience. You start out with something that your audience is familiar with, right? I was a fire inspector, about insurance and fires and stuff, and let me tell you all about my time doing that. And isn't it interesting that like the language that people were using in the factories was causing fires, right? Because they were thinking these drums were empty, and then they were throwing cigarettes in them because they didn't have ashtrays, and they blew up. Right? Isn't that interesting how in our language, like you might not have thought of this before, but language affects thought. And then there's this magic trick that often happens in good anthropology works where you say, well, now that you kind of got the basic idea of what I'm talking about, let me blow your mind, right? And I'm going to blow your mind by going into a completely different culture, which has a very different way of thinking. And in particular, what language or what culture does he use to illustrate this? Hopi, yeah, Hopi. This is a great example of what we call ethnology. In contrast to ethnography, which is a study of one particular culture at one particular place and time, what is ethnology? Told you it's the opposite. What is it? So what Worf is doing in this article. Yeah, compare and contrast. This goes back way before anthropology. If we were going to do early theory, we could talk about Tocqueville. He does this in the 1700s when he's on his road trip around America on horse and carriage, being like, Americans do this and French people do this. And he's constantly throughout the book doing it, right? That's a good example of ethnology or comparative method. And that's what Worf is doing in this, right? He calls it SAE, or Standard Average European, which to me, is basically just the Indo-European, the European part of Indo-European. He says that other languages in Europe probably do things differently, Uto-Baltic or Celtic. So the Euro part of Euro-American, right? SAE versus Hopi. And Hopi he uses both specifically as Hopi, but also as a way to say like, Udo-Aztecan languages more broadly, and then probably like indigenous languages more broadly, right? He's comparing these two different ideas. I was talking to a student about this today with learning Maya, because you go to Maya school. She's like, is it hard? And I said, yes, it's very hard. And it's not just the words, right? I remember going to like Spanish school and I'm like, this is fun. And then you start Maya school and you're like, English and Spanish are the same language pretty much, because Maya is just so different in a lot of ways, right? And there's lots of weird things about Maya beyond just learning the words, right? Like cat, it's me's, right? Or cinnamon, yeah, that's easy. That was like day one, I was rocking all the farm animals, I knew them. But then they started to introduce things that were weird, that we don't have in English, like something super basic, like counting, right? Counting is easy, but counting is hard in Maya. Because Maya people don't count the same way we do. I mean, they still count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they don't count in the same groups as we do, right? So if I put a bunch of stuff, put some stuff over here. I don't have the right shapes of things. Here's a pen. Here's a water bottle. I need something round. There's a round thing. Here's a round thing. A round thing. We'll draw some pictures. Here's a person. And here is a house. Right? And here's my pen. So I got a round thing, a person, a house, and a pen. How many things do I have? 4. But what did Maya say?
Let's just go all, first of all. We're just gonna-
I'd have one circle thing, one
Person.
living thing, one non-living thing, and one straight stick-like thing. You can't group them together. You could say, I'm building a house and I'm gonna have, 10 people over there. You can say, I have 10 to unir, right? And you can say, I have 10 tortillas or 3 tortillas, right? I have ul 3 round thing tortillas, but you can't group. I have 3 tortillas and 3 sticks, churros, I guess, but stick like, but you can't say I have stick things to eat, right? I have 3 round things to eat and 3 stick like things to eat, which is weird, right? Like if you've never thought about those categories before, it makes your brain hurt.
Yeah, we're just saying that sometimes like saying it wrong, like
There's just so much where I was just like, my brain just hurts, and it was like 6 hours a day, and I could only do like 3 or 4 at a time, where my brain would just be full, just like weird stuff. And Worth does a very similar thing when he's talking about Hopi here, right? He goes through lots of different examples, right? Especially with time, and Maya is the same way, right? That the way that you talk about, there's different weird language things, and that the way you talk about these things changes your perceptions, right? Another one, he talks about time. We're going to talk about Hopi time in just a second. And Maya is a great example, not just because Jose and I went to Maya school, so we actually have good examples. But it's actually, we'll talk about some of the critiques of Worf, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s later, and then some of the people who brought Worf back in the 90s and 2000s. And one of the language groups that was used really to show that Worf was right all along was Yucatec Maya. So it's actually, pretty perfect here. Another thing he talks about, that in terms of language being different, is how we talk about time. We have what's called a tense language. What are the tenses in our language? Past, present, future. And how do we draw that? How do we draw past, present, future? On a line, yeah, a timeline. It extends infinitely, or at least mostly infinitely. I'm sure the heat death of the universe will happen sometime. But past is over here, future is over here, and where's present? Exactly in the middle. Present. And this is completely natural for us, right? Would all of you have drawn that diagram in the exact same way, more or less?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? Is that the only way we could do it?
No.
Yeah, I'll give you a hint. It's, lots of cultures around the world do it differently. Some places do it like this, right? Past is down, future is this. And then Maya, you can talk about, some cultures will talk about the past being behind you, future in front of you. Others will switch it around. Where the past is in front of you because you can see it, you know what happened in the past, and the future is behind you because you don't know what's going to happen in the future, right? Worse, this is a really weird and very cultural thing that we think of as natural. But in fact, how do you experience, you don't really experience the future, right? We can dream about the future, we can plan for the future, but you can't experience the future. And you can't experience the past, right? You can remember the past, you can reminisce, but you can only do it in the present. So he says that the present does a lot of the heavy lifting in our thing, and we create these artificial past and futures, but we all just do it the same way. So when I tell you, the past, it's over here on a timeline, I think it's completely natural. But like in Hopi, it's going to be different, right? They have a very cyclical sense of time. Their language doesn't have a tense system. It has it's called an aspect system. It's Maya. In fact, Maya also has a similar system, which is I think is part of the reason why they used it for kind of talking about Wharf in these other contexts. In Hopi, right, you don't have, if you say, I'm going to go there, I'm going to be in class for the next 5 days, right? We think of it as time on, right? Here's the present, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. But in Hopi, it's going to be a day happening multiple times. So this is day, and it's a cycle, right? So it happens once, happens twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, right? So he's the example of like, it's not 5, you're not talking about 5 different guys, you're talking about the same person showing up every day at your house, right? It's not 5 separate people, it's the 5 things happening over and over. Maya is super weird and interesting like this as well. It's not a tense language, it's an aspect language. Again, how many tenses do we have? More or less, right? Present, past over here, and future. I can't remember how many aspects are there in Maya, 19 or 15 or 20?
You can never say like yesterday, you can't say that tomorrow, you can't say tomorrow, you can't say that tomorrow.
You can say it, but yeah, it has to be, it has, like how we have, how do we mark something in the past in our language? I was a student. I'm not a student anymore. I was, right? I walk on campus. I walked on campus. We put an ED marker on, right? Maya has very similar things to it as well. Tense is about time. Aspect is about how something happens, right? So there's this idea in linguistic anthropology, there's a difference between tense languages and aspect languages. People argue about this, how distinct that is, if it's, languages have some of each, which is probably right, but they emphasize different parts. We have these 3, right? In Maya, you can't just say the past, I walked, right? You could say, I walked personally yesterday. I walked personally 1 time in the past, right? Very hard to read. You could also say, I walked often in the past, more than once. You could also say, someone walked either once or many times. But I have no personal knowledge of this. I was not there. It's hearsay, right? I heard that Jose went to McDonald's last night. I wasn't there. I heard Jose goes to McDonald's every night. Right? But I wasn't there. You can also say, we actually do have an aspect marker in our language that it's very similar to mine. What does when a story starts in our language a long time ago, or once upon a time, my son loves this. Once upon a time, what does that mean? That is an aspect marker in our language. What does once upon a time mean?
It happened in
It happened in the past, but it means more than that. What does when I start a story with once upon a time? Once upon a time, Jose went to McDonald's.
Sounds like a long time ago.
Different world, it's magical or it's fairy tale-ish or something, right? It's a great example of an aspect marker that we use, right? If someone tells you once upon a time, it puts you in a different mentality about that story than if I was saying I was personally there. And Maya people have a once upon a time, which is kind of fun. That's 5 different past at least. There's probably more. Present has similar things. I am doing this thing once, or I do this thing all the time. I go to Eastern New Mexico University just about every day, right? That's a cyclical thing versus I went to a parade one time. Those are 2 different presents they have, and then they'll have similar things for the future. I will go, definitely. I probably will go, and it is prophesied in the far future that someone will go, or I will go, or something like that, right? What do you think the impact of having a language where every time you talk, you have to mark whether it's something that is probable or possible or happened to me personally or I heard about or is prophesied? How do you think having those kind of categories might make you think of life or the world differently? And he talks about this with Hopi as well, with Hopi preparations.
it's influenced by the culture. So in a way, it's helping you understand.
Yeah, and how would that make, if you spoke a language that had a system like this, instead of just past, present, future, how would that maybe change the way that you relate to the world?
You might start seeing it evolve into your own culture, or you want to make it evolve into the
Yeah.
culture.
Right, so if I'm speaking in a language that's always making me, in every sentence that I say, talk about whether it was something that happened one time or happened in multiple times, I might start to think about that. Right? He talks about Hopi talking about cycles and how a lot of their culture is about preparation, right? Because it's set up on this kind of cyclical cycle. And Worf makes a really strong argument that time in Hopi acts differently because it has all these aspects, and he has a whole book on Hopi time where he talks about, Hopi does a lot of things differently. They don't say 5 days from now, they'll say on the 5th day, which doesn't really seem like that much of a difference, but they use ordinals, right? It's like the 5 days happening one after, same day happening 5 times versus 5 separate days. And this book was super influential, and it, both had people who were super into it, and it had its haters. And one of the reasons I actually picked this article from this scan is it was someone's book who did not like war. Did you read the little marginal notes? It cracked me up, right? Like, if you believe this, you're a blockhead, you should be thrown in the river or something like that, right? This was a huge, Worf set off a huge debate, which, Worf died in the 40s. And it's at least until the late 90s, if not today, this is still something that's, brought up and fought back and forth in linguistics and in anthropology in general. And I think one of the reasons that a lot of people push off against it, is until you start to really learn a different language, it's like very, very different and very strange. It's hard to like see how these things would start to impact the way you think. But once you start to do it, and you live in a culture and you talk to people who think about these things in a certain way, you start to kind of internalize this behavior. So I want to show you a video. You probably have seen some of you have seen this before in Intro to Cultural, but you probably didn't have as much context for it. This is about Worf and his Hopi time book. Some of the haters who have responded to Hopi time, and then some of the haters of the haters who have worked to rehabilitate Worf, I think, in recent years. So let's take a look and we will talk about this.
Time takes forward in English, but did you know in Mandarin earlier is
Like you saw in the video, Worf and his ideas of linguistic relativity have been debated for the last 50 years or so. I think part of the problem is that a lot of this, there was no Sapir-Whorf hypothesis while either Sapir or Whorf were alive. So they never really got to like argue their points. It was always their students and other people who were arguing about what they said and what they really meant. And so like you saw in the video, you know, some people took it as language influences culture, and other people were like it determines culture, right? I think, like they said in the video, at least the weak version is pretty, you know, pretty well, it can be established. You know, the determines culture is maybe a little harder. Beginning pretty quickly, right? This Whorf dies in the early 40s. By the 1950s, especially in the 60s and 70s, there's a reaction to Whorf, probably with what's known as like linguistic universalism. People like Berlin and Kay looking at colors around the world and saying, you know, colors, well, they seem different. Maybe humans have some kind of underlying structure, right? Noam Chomsky, his underlying notions of grammar and things like that. Kind of pushing against the relativity of Sapir-Whorf. And then kind of in the 90s, especially, you know, a generation later, people coming up who are pushing back against that and showing in very both experimental context as well as ethnographic context how something like Sapir-Whorf can, you know, take place. What I think is really interesting about something like Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is it is very testable, right? It's something that you can do as even like a master's student project. You could go to Belize and you could look at how, you know, I'm going to read you, people are bilingual there, so I'm going to read you some phrases in English, and I'm going to read you some of the same phrases in Maya, and how do you understand these differently, or how do they make you act, right? So I'm going to tell you in English, go get the book off the shelf and bring it here, but if I read it in Maya and it says like, you know, habitually go and get the book, how is that going to make you act differently or something like that? One of my professors did this with direction in Yucatec Maya. How do you, if I was going to ask you, imagine you're over there at Burger King, or you're at McDonald's. Which direction is Burger King? Point to it. Which direction is Burger King?
From McDonald's?
Yeah.
From McDonald's would be that.
That way, right? Because you're using, it's hard because we're in the same plane, I guess. Let me do something else. Which direction is, you know anything in Clovis? Which direction is the zoo from Walmart in Clovis? We'll trick you, because you're not right here. Those are the only places I go in Clovis. All right. You could, one way you can do it, and we often do it, is to use kind of relative directions, right? I'm here and it's over here. But one of my professors argued that in Maya, they don't do that. They use absolute directions. So they're always going to be like, it's to the west or it's to the east versus like, oh, it's to the left or to the right, or it's that way or this way, right? You can do these kind of experiments and you can test it out, right? I'm going to test it with, I'm going to do this experiment with a group of English speakers and a group of Maya speakers, and I'm going to see which direction they point to the bus station, right? Are they using objective or are they using relative or something, right? So it's definitely something that if you're interested in kind of language and culture, something that's still ongoing and interesting to work on. We only have a few minutes left, but I want to talk about some of his other contributions. Him and Sapir, they're not just known for this. They also, along with Kroeber, one of Boaz's other students, really worked to, you know, do kind of like straight linguistic stuff, like figuring out, like proving that Aztecan was actually a language family, like that the languages of the South, some of the Southwestern languages were actually related to Nahuatl what the Aztecs speak, right? And showing that these were related in the same way that German and English are related instead of separate languages. He was also interested in Maya hieroglyphs, which I always think is really cool as someone who took a class in Maya hieroglyphs. At the time, Mr. J.S. Thompson, who you know, right, from his study of Maya people, both living and ancient, thought that Maya glyphs were all words, and Whorf said no, that they're actually syllables, or they're that you can sound them out, and they're not just all pictures of what they are. J.S. Thompson was the big dog and said no, but it turned out that Whorf was partially right, that they are logosyllabic, but that didn't come out for like 10 or 15 years after he died. But he was one of the early guys to to pioneer, working in hieroglyphics. He also, another one of his concepts that he came up with, which I think is really interesting, and we use this again, if you think back to Intro to Cultural on our Linguistics Week, this term of allophone, he invented this term. That is, for example, a sound or a letter, I guess, letter in a language that has more than one sound. So for instance, how do you pronounce this word? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna write things on paper. Allophone. How do you pronounce this word? What do you say? Water or water? Is it a T or a D? How many people say it like a D? Water. How many people are British and say it like water? Right? This is what we call a regional dialect. English people over in England say water, and we mostly say water. And if you hear, maybe it's New York, maybe, or somewhere up north, they do water, water, right? They can really emphasize it. But this is an example of an allophone, right? It looks like a T, but some people are going to say the T and some people are going to say the D. So, right, it's a sound or it's a letter that can be pronounced different ways. It could be based on region. It could be based on class. This is in England a lot, like how the Queen talks differently than the guys in Clockwork Orange or Pinky Blinders, right? It could be based on gender. It could be based on a whole bunch of different stuff. But he invented this term of allophone, which is pretty cool. He also invented the idea of what we call covert categories in linguistics. Categories. Or if you want to be a fancy linguist person, cryptotype. Secret types, right? He says that some languages have overt categories. So in Spanish, Jose, most words, almost all words, right, have a masculine or feminine, right? This is an example of an overt category. In English, do we do that? Not usually, right? When do we have to say, so you can say, in Spanish, you couldn't say it, like you could say a walk, right? But you'd usually say like a male walk or a female walk or something, right? The gender isn't inclusive in the topic, right? Or the word. In English, we don't do that unless it's like third person singular, right? So I walked doesn't mark gender at all, right? Doesn't say if I'm a man or woman, but he, she, or it does. It's an example of a covert category. Only in certain contexts in English are you going to get the gender. It's built into the language, and we have to kind of think of it, in our minds, but we don't say it. And so he's the one who invented this category, covert categories, as well as allophones. So he does lots of different things, but Sapir-Whorf is probably, what he is most known for today. And like I said, Sapir-Whorf kind of fell out of favor probably by the 50s, 60s, and 70s especially. But beginning in the 90s, people like Planker, Lucy, and people like that, linguists started to bring it back and being like, a lot of what people say about Whorf is not what actually Whorf was saying, right? They take it, they caricaturize it, they make him seem like he's over exaggerating. But if we actually look at what Whorf says, and if we actually go to these other cultures and look at them and see what they're actually like, we can start to see some of these differences. And it's still ongoing, right? The behavioral universe, or the behaviorist versus kind of the universalist. But what I really like about this debate is it's something you can test, right? It's not about like the nature of the universe or something like that. It's like an experimental hypothesis. Does language impact thought? Well, you can debate it, but we can also just go out and test it. We can run experiments in different cultures, and we can see what the results are, right? All right, we are about out of time today. We are going to jump over to Malinowski next time. So if you haven't read that, please do. We'll be talking about functionalism as well as Malinalici's Field Work Revolution. So we met on Friday for that. Any questions before we wrap up today? Cool. Are you all feeling